We'll start with Anne-Marie McCallion on making feminist progress, autoethnography as women's philosophy. Welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's really wonderful to be participating in such an intriguing and timely conference. I'm very sorry I can't be there with you all today. The schedule looks absolutely fantastic. So I'll certainly be joining the live streaming for your talks and the keynotes and the plenary speakers. So yes, my talk today is called Making Feminist Progress, Autoethnography as Women's Philosophy. And just a little bit of background into the project and the paper. This talk is kind of an accumulation of ideas that I've been grappling with really for about 10 years now, even back when I was a postgraduate student. And when I was a postgraduate student at the department I was in, there was a lot of talk about pragmatism in philosophy and Wittgensteinian ethics specifically. But at the same time as that discussion about pragmatism was happening, there was a lot of interest surrounding the discussion of women's participation in philosophy. And at that time, there was just starting to be widespread recognition about women's underrepresentation in the discipline. And having had that background then, ever since those postgraduate days, I've been really interested in the relationship between pragmatism and women's participation in philosophy. So pragmatism, research methods in philosophy, what makes philosophy distinctive as a body of knowledge, and women's participation, and how those two things are interrelated. So this work, or this talk, is based on a paper which was published recently in the Journal of Metaphilosophy called How Can We Build a Women's Philosophy? And this talk is a continuation and a development of that paper. It's kind of developing the work of a much underrated philosopher called Nancy Holland, who in 1999 wrote a really brilliant book called Is Women's Philosophy Possible? And if you ever get the chance to read this book, I strongly recommend it. It's quite hard to find. I've noticed that it's quite under-sourced in libraries, but it really is a very underrated work, and it's a brilliant work, I think, in particular, not just within feminist metaphilosophy, but also the feminist historiography of philosophy. In that work, Nancy Holland proposes a concept that she calls women's philosophy. And she says that philosophy seems to be quite distinctive as a branch of knowledge because there doesn't seem to be any discernible thing that we can call women's philosophy. So if you look at Gobbet 1 in section 1 of your handout, this is how Nancy Holland opens her discussion of women's philosophy. She writes, there is women's literature, women's music, women's history, and so on. There is philosophy done by women, and even feminist critiques of the philosophical tradition, but there is little that could be unequivocally called women's philosophy. So she defines women's philosophy as distinctive from feminist philosophy. She says that feminist philosophy is engaged in a broadly construed project of critique of a concept that she calls abstract individualism. And abstract individualism is this idea that ideas can be separated from humans and human context and human history, and that human context and human history can be compartmentalized. She describes abstract individualism as not just a particular view about human nature, but a particular view about theories as well, as being isolated from a grander social and historical context. So that's how she defines feminist philosophy. Women's philosophy, or what she wants to call women's philosophy, on the other hand, is a mode of philosophy that she says does not conjure up the deliberate intention of mustering theoretical force. And what she means by that, or what I take her to mean by that, is a mode of doing philosophy that explores women's lived experiences without the need to justify. So she seems to be describing a body of knowledge that aims more at description than at justification. And in her work, particularly within the first and second chapter of her book, she's engaged in a project of showing why there's something fundamentally incongruent about this idea of a purely descriptive, exploratory women's philosophy and the theoretical norms and assumptions that make philosophy distinctive as a body of knowledge. So her central argument then, or one of the elements of her central argument, is this idea that there's something fundamentally incompatible between what she's calling a woman's philosophy and the norms that demarcate the discipline. In response to her own question then, is a woman's philosophy possible? Holland deliberately leaves the answer to that open. And she argues that actually we cannot answer the question of whether or not a woman's philosophy is possible until we first engage in 3 preliminary projects. And the first project is a historical feminist deconstruction, so an analysis of the history of philosophy along feminist lines, and then the further development of what she calls a woman's global phenomenology and a woman's hermeneutics. And she leaves exactly what those projects are, the global phenomenology and the hermeneutics, relatively underexplored. But her main point is to say that we actually cannot envision or imagine what a woman's philosophy would be, or how we might overcome the perceived tension between the disciplinary norms that demarcate philosophy as a body of knowledge and this proposed women's philosophy. We can't reconcile that tension until we engage in these 3 preliminary projects. So my work then, and what I'm going to spend the duration or the remainder of this talk focusing on, is about bridging this gap. And I argue, in contrast to Holland then, that not only is a woman's philosophy possible, but it is real and it's currently happening. And a lot of my work recently has been focused on a methodology which has been very popular in the social sciences, but it has been underutilized, and I would argue drastically underutilized in philosophy. And that's the method of autoethnography. And I'm going to argue then that feminist autoethnography matches the criteria for what Holland stipulates as a woman's philosophy. Autoethnography then is a research approach which centers the lived experiences of the researchers. And this began kind of in the mid-20th century within the social sciences, particularly within the field of sociology and anthropology. And it emerged as a response to concerns about disembodied conceptions of objectivity. So it sort of emerged as an alternative to what they call positivist research methods. So this would be largely quantitative research methods, or what we would think of now as quantitative research methods. And particularly, what's relevant to my talk is a work by a feminist sociologist called Elizabeth Ettore, and her book is titled Autoethnography as a Feminist Method. So, as autoethnography emerges in the latter half of the 20th century, in the early part of the 21st century, we start to see it used more and more within feminist circles. So within particularly feminist sociology and feminist anthropology. And in her work, Autoethnography as a Feminist Method, Elizabeth Ettore makes the case for autoethnography to be seen and witnessed as a specifically feminist research method. And if you look at Gobbet 2 in section 2, this is how Elizabeth Ettore frames the subject of autoethnography. She says, when I first started to look at autoethnography as a feminist method, I became increasingly mindful that disenchantment with the dominant Cartesian paradigm of rationality at the heart of modern social sciences led us as scholars to narrative. We did this because narrative emphasizes pluralities of truths that all cultures claim about themselves. Narratives shift or pushes us from notions that there is a single cultural perspective revealing an irrefutable set of truths, and through narratives, any scholar can achieve an understanding of personal experiences. So Ettore is saying that autoethnography emerges as a response to this Cartesian paradigm, which had hitherto dominated the social sciences. In contrast to more established or more traditional research approaches in the social sciences, autoethnography situates, orients research through lived experiences and the lived experiences of the researcher. Ettore makes an important distinction between what she calls autobiography and autoethnography. She argues that autoethnography is not autobiography. So it is not as if, as researchers, we simply tell our story and that amounts to research within a particular field. Rather, she really emphasizes this idea that it is not simply in telling our stories that we arrive at truth or knowledge, but rather it's about situating our stories. It's about connecting our experiences to wider sociological, historical moments and movements. It is, so to speak, the embodiment of the feminist mantra, the personal is political. It is as if the personal is political becomes a research approach. And that's essentially what Ettore tries to achieve in that work. Now back to my own claim, which is that we can actually see feminist autoethnography as a woman's philosophy. I think we can witness the construction of the preliminary projects that Holland proposes, which she calls the global phenomenology, the feminist hermeneutics, and feminist deconstruction within established works of feminist autoethnography. So we can see the feminist deconstruction or the feminist historiography within the way that Ettore frames the research approach of autoethnography. She says that it is a responsive approach. That is to say, it makes a sense we arrive at autoethnography because we are disenchanted with the dominant, disembodied or Cartesian paradigms, what she calls Cartesian paradigms. And we can also see what I would think of as a global phenomenology and a feminist hermeneutics within autoethnography. When we survey the range of approaches and the range of styles that feminist researchers have brought to the autoethnographic method. So just to give you one example, if you look at Gobbet 4 of section 2, you'll see a direct quotation from a feminist autoethnographer called Shelby Swafford. And in this quotation, Swafford is talking about her own lived experience of abortion, which took place at the height of reactionary pro-life versus pro-choice debates within the United States. And she uses what we call a performative autoethnography to detail not just the experience of her abortion, but also to detail the tremendous conflicts and surrounding conflicting political narratives at the time. So she sheds light on that experience or on the political significance of surrounding debates through telling her story, through discussing that experience. And she phrases that experience in a series of poetic prose that really critiques assumptions about the pro-life versus pro-choice dichotomy. And her main point, I suppose, within that work is to show that actually it is not as simple as we can be pro-life or pro-choice, but actually in her position as she says, as a mother, as an expectant mother, there were a whole series of tensions and conflicts that she had to navigate through that were not being foregrounded within these very abstract debates that were happening surrounding pro-life and pro-choice. And we can contrast Swafford's autoethnographic and poetic description of her experience with, I suppose, more traditional works that have taken place within, particularly within applied philosophy, or what is sometimes called practical philosophy, regarding the ethics of abortion. So, with that in mind then, I'm going to argue that because we can witness these elements of the feminist hermeneutics, the feminist style, the feminist deconstruction within feminist autoethnography, quite simply, I'm going to say, we should begin to call feminist autoethnography women's philosophy. And as philosophers, we should begin citing it, we should begin teaching it, and we should begin utilizing it as a research approach. And doing so constitutes significant progress for feminist philosophy because it gives us the ability as feminist philosophers, or as philosophers in general, to utilize not just a research approach, but a whole body of literature that seems to overcome what Holland identifies as barriers to a woman's philosophy. So Holland, similar to Autor, is disenchanted with the disembodied approaches within philosophy. She is disenchanted by what she sees as a series of disciplinary norms and assumptions which prohibit the exploration of women's lived experiences. Now I take it that if we are sympathetic to what Holland identifies as barriers in mainstream philosophy, to a woman's philosophy, and not just Holland, I should point out a series of other feminist philosophers have reiterated these arguments. If we're sympathetic to that purview, then we should adopt feminist autoethnography. Now, the obvious objection to that would be, well, calling feminist autoethnography women's philosophy simply does not overcome those barriers. It does not necessarily change the shape and form of the discipline such that we can do that as researchers. Now I take it that if we adopt what I call the living practice view of philosophy, which is that it is largely framed by a series of contingent social rules that are propagated by individual practitioners, then the task becomes not theoretical, as Holland sets it up, but primarily practical. So the task becomes one of changing public perception of what counts as philosophy, and not necessarily as a theoretical project regarding constructing new paradigms and frameworks. And that's it for me.
Thank you for the fascinating talk. Now we have some questions. You go first.
Shall I? Okay. Thank you. Sorry you can't see me. I'm Onerva Kianlinna. This talk resonated with me as an aesthetician. And as I was listening, or as I was reading the handout, what caught my eye was a definition of self-ethnography theory. Is a research approach which centers the lived experiences of the researcher, and it emphasizes embodied subjectivity. Well, this sounds like a definition of aesthetics to me. Okay, so this is not a new approach, even in philosophy. It's been done for centuries, but it hasn't been particularly feminist. Aesthetics is not women's philosophy. The history of aesthetics is very male-dominated, and particularly white male-dominated. So now I'm just trying to push. What's? Oh, sorry. Does it work better if it's? No.
Just go on.
Okay, yeah. I go on. So does it? Why? What's inherent in autoethnography that makes it particularly feminist or particularly women's philosophy if we can't say that about aesthetics?
Yeah, brilliant question. I suppose my initial response to the question is to say, I suppose aesthetics hasn't had a similar movement, and feel free to speculate along with me about why that might be the case. Why feminist researchers have gravitated more towards autoethnography than they have to aesthetics, I can only put down to, I guess, disciplinary norms. So obviously autoethnography, or what I've called here autoethnography, takes root in disciplines like anthropology and sociology, where perhaps there has been more open or successful or foregrounded discussions of feminist history than there has necessarily been in mainstream philosophy. And I wonder if maybe that's simply it. Maybe feminist researchers have gravitated to autoethnography within the social sciences and sort of carved out the possibility of it being a distinctively feminist research approach in the social sciences, whereas there doesn't seem to be a similar movement in philosophy. And in relation to what makes it distinct, I suppose, from aesthetics, I would say it is really that. It is the fact that it has this distinctively feminist area in a way that, to the best of my knowledge and to what and in line with what you're saying, aesthetics doesn't seem to have done. So in feminist autoethnography, in that branch of literature then, there's a wide array of texts, performative pieces that address topics such as abortion or other issues that we've taken within feminist research to be pertinent to women's lives in particular, and connected that to a broader feminist sociology and feminist history. So I would say that's really what makes it distinctive. It's the fact that it already seems to have this feminist framework and feminist audience. I'm sorry, does that quite answer your question?
Apparently, yes. Now, we are sort of running out of time, so if you had like a 30-second comment, we might have time for that.
Oh, just
yeah.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a real pleasure to be at this timely conference.
Did you have?
Oh, I did have a really quick question. Is that all right? Annie,
yeah.
Hello, it's Helen. You can't see me. This is just a really quick, naive question. Why autoethnography and not just ethnography? I'm pretty sure, like, you get taught this in first year sociology. But like, is it because the philosopher was the conceptual resources to say stuff that is going to be philosophically illuminating, whereas if you just ask a random person, you might not. Is that the reason?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
You have largely answered your own question then. So it's as opposed to ethnography, which is largely the researcher going into distinctive cultural environments and observing. In autoethnography, the researcher, I suppose, looks inward and connects that outward. So they connect their lived experiences to a wider culture, rather than in ethnography, where the researcher is sort of positioned in this very abstract way to a surrounding culture and is only looking outward, but not sort of reflexively engaging in their own assumptions.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you very much. All the best.